All right, let's get going. Couple things. Here, don't forget blood drives tomorrow. So you can donate. You can find someone else to donate for you, or you can come and talk to me. If you try to donate and get rejected, that happens. Just get you get a note thanking you for coming in or for trying or something like that. If you sign up, I'm sure there's a sign-up sheet outside the Tri-Beta office. I'll get that list. If you can't donate on Tuesday, tomorrow, then you could always go to one of the donor centers here or one of the other blood drives. So go ahead and do that. Lab this week, this is a diaspore lab. Make your diaspores. Test them out. We'll see how they do. We'll see how they do. We have final exams coming up. Monday, 8 a.m. Right? So I'll do my best to get here earlier, and then you can start it as soon as you get there. Open this up. Exam 3, I released the grades last week once I had the last of the makeups that happened. So you saw your grades, but I'll pass back the sheets. I also have the copies of the actual exam. So if you want to pick that up too, pick up your copy of the exam, that's fine. Yeah, if you want to pick up one of those, that's fine. I'll let you come by and pick that up. All right, so I'll pass these back at the end of class. If you're not here and you want to pick them up, come to my office, get them. All right. The IDEA evaluations. This up here. So this is my side of it. So I can't see who did it. All I can see is that we have 73 students enrolled. Currently we have a 56% response rate. So you've got half a point now on the overall course grade. So if you haven't taken it, you got 5 days remaining. Closes on the 3rd at 11:59. All right, and then I can't see the results until after the grades are due up in Rampart. So this is what I get. This is what I see. So we're at 56%. We'll check it, take it. Emails will stop coming to you. Any questions? We're going to have one more quiz that goes live today over competition. Should go live. You'll have until Wednesday night, end of Wednesday, to do this one, as well as completing the reproduction one, the life history reproductive strategy quizzes. At that time, I'll lock them down, and then the keys will be available. That way you can check them out. Start review. All right. This is where we left off. So we're talking about competition. We're kind of moving towards the communities. We are moving towards community interactions. And the key one was competition. So we introduced this idea of competition where you have to demonstrate that there is some sort of negative effect when the two individuals are competing for a limiting resource. So you have to demonstrate that there is a limiting resource that they're going after, and two, that there is some sort of negative effect. And that it's actually that limiting resource that's causing the shift in where we find them, or the decrease in carrying capacity or intrinsic rate of growth. With the competition, we reviewed exploitation competition, where it's about getting to the resource first, getting to it and utilizing it first before your competitor. You have interference competition, where you actively interfere with the other individual's ability to acquire those resources. So instead of getting it first, now you're actually trying to inhibit the other from getting it himself. All right, and then we have this preemptive competition and diffuse competition. The preemptive competition is more relevant to plants because their space depends on where they germinate. So where they fall, where the seed falls and ends up germinating, that is their space. If they can get to that open space first, then they preempt others from taking over that area. Diffuse competition is just recognizing that you might only have very minor effects of competition, minor negative effects, but collectively you can have it, once you take into account all of the competitors, you can have a pretty major effect. So plants in an understory, that was a good example. They're dealing with not only the plant that's right next to them, but they're dealing with all of the plants in that area that are all competing for the same light and nutrients and water and so forth. All right, so any questions over competition before we start the new one? All right, so we didn't really talk about how strong is this competition. We just kind of put competition in a broad term that we're competing for these limited resources. Well, how severe is this competition? How severe are the negative effects? Well, that ultimately depends on the degree of overlap in their resource usage. All right, so if you have two competing species that overlap a lot in the resource usage and the resources that they require, then you're going to see much stronger competition compared to those two species that only overlap very, very little. We can predict the strength of this competition by examining this idea of niche overlap. All right, so the niche, concept of the niche, describes resource utilization. Describes resource utilization and as well as partly law of tolerance. It's going to define mathematically and in our case graphically where our organism can live and survive and the broadness of that area. All right, so the ecological niche is the set of biological and physical resources that determine the growth, survival, and reproduction of a species. All right, so the law of tolerance was just about the abiotic factors. That's all the law of tolerance was saying. The niche takes that into account and incorporates resources, incorporates the physical resources. All right, so this ecological niche is a set of biological and physical resources that determine the growth, survival, and reproduction. This has also been called the Hutchinsonian niche because Asa Hutchinson described it in 1957. His paper was actually rather interesting. He was looking at songbirds in a tree, in several trees, and he mapped out the niche space, the niche utilization for the different species of songbirds. Some songbirds basically took a territory along a branch, the horizontal space. Some songbirds jumped between branches but remained close to the trunk. Other birds utilized the periphery of the tree branches. Some were restricted right to the top, some were down close to the bottom. So what you've had, or what you saw here, is these birds have these very defined spaces. If you remove one bird, one species, then that empty space could be filled by one of the other species that's there. So from that paper, he came up with this idea of the niche, which would be called the Hutchinsonian niche, and we've just defined it or refined it as the ecological niche. This is more specifically what's considered an n-dimensional hypervolume. All right? So what we can do is basically look at every single resource, every single abiotic factor that's there, and start with each factor, with each resource, we're slowly adding number of dimensions that we can model mathematically. It's a lot harder to do graphically. So here's an example. These are dissolved oxygen and we have prey size, right? And this is, I base it on depth because what we can do is look at, let's say, an aquatic organism where depth has a major role. Why does depth matter in an aquatic system? What's that? Light. Yep, so light gets filtered out as it goes through water, all right? And not just light, all right? Also, oxygen and temperature, right? So with the temperature, yeah, it's not just the light, and you get high intensity light warms up the water, but then the density differences set up these two different zones. You could say 3 zones if you count the thermocline as that third zone, right? And you have limited mixing and all that stuff. So aquatic systems, I think, are rather interesting to study. But anyways, we're going to look at dissolved oxygen. We're going to see prey size. So dissolved oxygen drops off as we increase the depth, and it drops off rather quickly once we hit past the thermocline. All right, because you don't get mixing, and anything that's consuming oxygen just gradually consumes it. And you don't have light, so you don't have photosynthesis regenerating oxygen down there. If we look at an organism may have a law of tolerance zone, a tolerance zone of this amount of dissolved oxygen. All right, so it could survive all the way down to about this level. All right, so this is our law of tolerance, the range of tolerance. Prey size, well, we're going to assume we're dealing with a macroinvert that is a predator. All right, and its preferred prey size is between this zone. All right, so dissolved oxygen, that's our abiotic factor. Prey size is our resource. All right, prey size is our resource, and it follows if our prey size increases and then drops off as we go through depth. We're targeting a prey size that is above a certain level. Anything lower, it's just, you don't have enough reward for hunting and handling the prey. So our prey size is going to be at this spot. All right, this spot and higher. So if we look at the depth, where these occur, and we take into account our dissolved oxygen and the prey size, we come up with this two-dimensional space here where this could be described as dissolved oxygen and prey size if we flip things over. So our square, that shaded square, is all of the area that our organism can survive. There's sufficient oxygen throughout this entire range, and there's sufficient prey size for it to feed on. This is our ecological niche. If we add another layer to that, so let's say we add, give me another one. We have prey size, we have dissolved oxygen, pH. Let's add pH. pH doesn't get added to this two-dimensional graph. Instead, what we do is we add it to a third dimension. So now we make it a three-dimensional object. If we wanted to add a fourth dimension, how you model fourth dimensions, usually the change through time, but mathematically you can do it. You can add a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. All right, so I depicted this as more of a square, but we often see these as circular structures. All right, because of our, because we're normally dealing with like normal curves, normal distributions. All right, so this would be the Hutchinsonian niche. Anywhere outside of that space, our organism can't survive, either because it's outside of its tolerance zone, or there's not enough physical resources there, or not the appropriate physical resource for it to survive. All right, now we have one of these for each of our species. We have both of these for each of our species. What we can do then is look at how much they overlap. And now we're going to take a step back to do more at a you can say a one-dimensional scale, because I think it's a little bit easier to understand and come up with these terms. All right, so we're interested in resource overlap. That's what we're going for. All right, so in our curves, in our niche, our two-dimensional space, that square, we're defining it as, let's say, our first bell curve. All right, species one, that's our resource utilization. It's really good at utilizing the intermediate area of our resource. At the extremes, it's not so good. So in that intermediate area of the resource, we see a lot of individuals. Near the extremes, we don't see a whole lot. Some of them, we have enough resources there to support some, but they're not gonna thrive. And what you should recognize is that this curve is very similar to our law of tolerance curve. All right, it's very similar to our law of tolerance, but this time we're dealing with resources. All right, so our first term is niche breadth. The niche breadth, is how wide our actual resource usage is. So it's from basically our two extremes. The tolerance zone, if we're dealing with an abiotic factor, would be niche breadth. But since we're dealing with resources, that's the lower and the upper extreme of the resources that our organism needs and can utilize. And we have this niche breadth for both species. All right? We can have a narrow niche breadth, we can have a wider niche breadth. Niche separation is the difference in the peaks of our resource usage. So the peaks represent basically the optimum resource type. So this could be prey size. The optimum prey size is here for species one, but it's going to be larger for species two. All right, so the niche separation is the difference between our two peaks. And we utilize the peaks because that usually represents the average resource preference. And then we have this area right down here where both of the curves overlap. This is our niche overlap. We're going to define that as alpha, because this is the extent of common use of a resource by two or more species. Note, again, two or more species, because we can have that diffuse competition at work. This is the area where both species can utilize that same resource. It's this area where competition is basically occurring. It's for this space. Ready? Yeah, leave that up. All right. So the more of this niche overlap, the higher this niche overlap, the higher the intensity of competition. The less overlap you have, the less intense competition you'll see. Now with diffuse competition, you're going to have a small amount of overlap with each of the competitors, or among each of the competitors. But collectively, one individual, one species could feel a lot of niche overlap, even though it's a small amount for each of its competitors. So niche overlap is alpha. That's the extent of our resource utilization. And that's our overlap. Ready? All right, so it's not, the intensity of competition isn't related or isn't only affected by the niche overlap. There's a couple other things that can affect the intensity of competition. One of is population density. Because again, we can't just look at individuals. We have to consider the population size. And population size works, but really density is what matters. Because each individual in our population is competing with each individual of our competitor. So, competition is, in and of itself, a density-dependent factor. That's why we have that logistic curve. Why it flatlines. It's from interest-specific competition. But if we expand it to the community, the larger our population density, the more competition we're going to feel. The second thing that affects our intensity are the disturbances, or it can affect it. All right, it can affect it. So disturbances are things like fires, flooding, right? Windstorms that take out patches of a forest. These are all going to disrupt the community in some way, and that will have an effect on the intensity of competition. When you change the intensity of competition, you can change the community structure. You can change the interactions that are taking place. So with our disturbances, we can have infrequent and or minor disturbances, or we can look at disturbances as being frequent and or very intense disturbances. All right, so kind of two different extremes. You have infrequent versus frequent, and then you can have minor disturbances versus major disturbances. All right, so the minor disturbances would be something where you might have a patch of the grassland catch fire, but most of it stays the same. So you only burn a small percentage, and that only happens maybe every 2, 3, 4 years. So it's a minor disturbance, happens relatively infrequently. If you have that fire that happens every 2 years and it takes out the entire grassland, well, it's frequent because it happens every 2 years. You don't give the community enough time to become established and kind of stabilize. And not only that, but you've taken out the entire grassland and did 100% reset of that area. That's a pretty intense disturbance. All right, so this is what we're talking about. Intensity, frequency of these disturbances can play a role through their effect on competition. All right, so if we have infrequent and or minor disturbances, things that are just very minor and it's relatively infrequent. In these types of communities, competition remains strong. Competition remains strong, and because of this, we typically see our populations growing towards their carrying capacity. They grow and reach their carrying capacity. Since we're getting to that, then the life history strategies that tend to be exhibited by those species and those populations tend to be those case-selected strategies. All of those strategies that are selecting for or pushing for good competitors in their offspring. And these are minor disturbances that just have a minimal effect on our communities, or they're infrequent. It happens, let's say, once every 20 to 40 years. 50-year floods, 100-year floods. Those are pretty infrequent. Even though they could be major, they're very infrequent. So the communities in those areas will likely approach carrying capacity. We're going to see case-selected life history strategies. But if we get these high-frequency disturbances, things that happen regularly, frequently, and they're pretty major, then our populations are usually far from the carrying capacity because they never get to that point. That community is growing up, maybe it hits the halfway, and then there's a disturbance and it takes their population size right back down. Because we're never really getting up to that carrying capacity and our populations are never really feeling the full effect of competition, interest-specific competition, you're going to see the life history strategies start to be reflective as a R-selected strategy. So we're going to favor our fast growers. We're going to favor our good dispersers because once we get an area wiped out, it's going to benefit those who get there first more than those that have to take 5, 6, 7 years to kind of slowly move into that area. lawn care, cutting grass, that would be a pretty intense and frequent disturbance. All right, the grass gets established, but if you're looking at weeds, every time a weed starts to grow up, you're cutting it. So you can eliminate the weeds. So you're kind of selecting for these fast dispersers, these fast growing weed species. Get up, flower, set seed first before the lawnmower comes down and takes them out. And you see that. There's a study out there that looked at lawn weeds on a campus, on a college campus. You have, and you probably see it. I don't see it as much here, but at certain schools you do. Of course, the architects plot their buildings and their walkways to be aesthetically pleasing, right? But usually those walkways are not the most direct routes to the buildings, and you have limited amount of time to get from one class to another, right? So on the college campus, you have these areas where you can see walkways through the grass, I should say paths, that the students take, and they're just, you wear them down, all right, so that the path just naturally forms in the dirt. That's a frequent, high-intense disturbance. People are constantly walking, they're trampling the plants, versus areas that are 10 feet away that are relatively undisturbed. Very infrequent disturbances. And what they showed was that the plant species that they were looking at, those that grew in that disturbed area tended to be the good dispersers, the fast growers, and those that grew offside of that path tend to be these good competitor weed species. That was probably done in like the 80s or 90s. I'd have to find that paper again and post it. All right, so disturbances can have an effect. There is one species that we can talk about called the fugitive species. These fugitive species are very poor competitors. Very poor competitors. But they exploit disturbances, and that's why they persist. All right, they can't really compete with any other species, but what they specialize in is getting to a freshly disturbed area, growing, reproducing, getting their population size up, and then dispersing to a new area. So you can think about these fugitive species as constantly jumping habitats, jumping locations, because what they're trying to do is avoid competitors. Get there, reproduce, mate, get their offspring reproducing and mating, and so forth. So why is it called a fugitive species? What do fugitives do? They avoid the law. They try to. That's a concept. They're avoiding their competitors. All right, so what's the effect of competition? The effect of competition is that we're going to shift our niche. Our species will shift the niche in some way. All right, so recall again, the niche reflects the pattern of resource use. And the ecological niche really is basically that broad concept. But we can narrow it down to a fundamental niche and a realized niche. Now, both of them mean the same as an ecological niche. The ecological niche is that general term. It describes what niche is, what a niche is. So the fundamental niche is the theoretical niche. That is the niche that we would see in the absence of competition. We expect to see that. The realized niche is the actual niche that results from competition. Now these two figures are from your book. Not huge fans of it. I don't think it depicted it quite well enough. I think it's a little misleading. All right, it's a little misleading. But let's see if I can fix it a little bit on the board. So our fundamental niche is the theoretical niche. This is in the absence of competition. So we will use this is our frequency. Actually, what we will do is say population size. we have our populations. That's species number 1. These are tiny. Blue might show up. Maybe. There's brown. That's gross. All right, so that's species number 1. What we could say is species number 2 looks something like this. All right, both of these would represent our fundamental niches. Both of these would represent our fundamental niche. Because in the absence of competition, that's where they could survive, that's where they would live. But once we introduce competition and put both species together, what we may see is something like this. We may see something more like this. We still remain within our upper and lower bounds. But what we've done is shifted our overall resource usage. So this here is our fundamental niche, but in reality, we end up seeing these two realized niches. Now, this is just one aspect. The realized niche, though, is a subset of our fundamental niche. It's the realization of competition. Now, how I depicted this is just one possible outcome. I depicted it as where we had more of a shift in our resource usage. We basically restricted ourselves to lower area for species 1, upper area for species 2. But that doesn't have to happen. Think back to the barnacle example. The one example, it utilized a wide range, but the other species can only utilize a very, very narrow range. So the fundamental niche and the realized niche for one species remain basically the same. The other one had a much broader fundamental niche, and then it was narrow. All right. So the reason I didn't like this figure is because it changed our upper and lower ends. Let's talk about any questions on fundamental versus realized niches. Let's talk about what happens, what can happen. So our realized niche is a change in location and or niche breadth. Can. All right, so where we are or how wide. Oops, are we going to get that? Yeah, we'll get that. All right. So there's going to be limits to how much we can change. All right, we can shift left or right. We can expand or contract. All right, based on our competitors. In some cases, you introduce a competitor that's smack dab in the middle, and then you've got basically subpopulations. One population utilizes the lower resource, one utilizes the upper resource. That's a possibility. So we're still going to remain within our upper and lower bound until evolution takes over. So there's going to be limits on how much we can change and on whether we can change. So in some species, we can't survive. Our fundamental niche says this is how wide it is. Our realized niche, we don't ever find one because the other competitor is a better competitor. And the result then is competitive exclusion. That competitor comes in and excludes the species that was initially there. So competitive exclusion is the extinction of one species due to competition from another. This is a classic example. You've probably seen this. We talked about competition in the Bio 1 and 2 course. I'm sure you've seen this. So these are paramecium. Grow them in a petri dish. All right, you can put them up in competition. All right. Individually, so the blue lines are the populations individually. So you can see paramecium caudatum grows to a carrying capacity of about 120 individuals. Aurelia grows to about 200 or so individuals in their dish. If you put them in competition, so if you put them in the same dish, Aurelia still grows up, can survive. They grow up to about 150, maybe 140. Caudatum starts to grow, and then they slowly go to extinction, local extinction in that dish. We would say paramecium aurelia competitively excludes paramecium caudatum. And you notice the effective competition is going to have some negative effect. It can affect our R, intrinsic rate of growth. It can affect our carrying capacity. In this case, we saw a change in our R and a change in the carrying capacity. We reached our carrying capacity at a much slower rate, so it took us longer to get there, and not only that, but our carrying capacity is lower because we have fewer resources. Some of those resources were consumed by this other population. This one had slower growth initially and then completely dropped out. That's a pretty big negative effect. So we see this competitive exclusion, and that has led to the competitive exclusion principle. This is the idea that two species cannot coexist on a single limiting resource. No matter what you would say, what you would do, one species will always competitively exclude another species. And you could say, well, that doesn't make sense. We've got competitors occurring. Yeah, they do. They occur in the same area. They're competing for the same resource. But that just means each species has its own niche space where it doesn't have to worry about competition. All right? So if you have two species that overlap in the same niche space, our individuals cannot co-occur. One will always exclude the other from that resource space. But if they've got their own space where they can survive in without having competition, they will. That is our co-occurrence. So I put this in blue in a gray box. Two species cannot occupy the same niche. That's our same ecological niche. They can't. That follows the competitive exclusion principle. Someone will always win out. All right? So this is immediate. This is over a very short time scale. Competitive exclusion will take place. Or they'll just partition where they occur. Separate where they occur to minimize their competition. What happens over an evolutionary time scale? Well, over an evolutionary time scale, what we'll see is potential shifts in our fundamental niche. And if we shift our fundamental niche, we can then gradually adjust how much competition we're actually feeling. So over evolutionary time, one thing that we could see is this idea, this concept of character displacement. Character displacement is a shift in the niches of a competing species that reduces competition among them. Right? This isn't adjusting our realized niche. What we're talking about is a shift in our fundamental niche. It is our shift in perhaps species 1 here that gets into competition in an area And then over time, it shifts its fundamental niche to use a higher resource to perhaps lower the effect of competition. Ooh, we didn't get to see that. Let's move that in. See, I just moved it, drew the arrow. All right, so character displacement is a shift in the niches of competing species that reduces competition among them. So natural selection is going to favor those species that utilize the resource that is not under competition. Those individuals that don't have to compete are going to get the resources better than those that are in competition. And that means those individuals that have the adaptations to utilize that range of resource will leave more offspring, and thus we'll gradually see our population shift. Great examples are the Darwin's finches. You have two species of finches. Their beak depth corresponds to the types of seeds that they can consume, because beak depth adjusts the physics of cracking the shell. Their leverage, you could say PSI. What's the term? What's the physics term? Not leverage. It's cracking strength. Probably is the best you can say. But when they're on separate islands, they tend to have the same depth of beaks. All right, they're going to be adapted to whatever seeds are out there on the island. And that seems to be optimum for them. Selection favors that beak size. But when you put these two on the same island, evolution selected for smaller beak depths for one species and larger beak depths for the other. So here, when you put them together, they're competing for the same resource on that island. They have a high degree of overlap in their niche space, in their fundamental niche. And then over time, their fundamental niche starts to move apart, where one favors the smaller seed size, the other favors the larger seed size. And by doing that, they no longer compete for those seeds that are best cracked at the intermediate beak size. So what you can say is that the intermediate beak size allows them to feed on small seeds and larger seeds, where their preference is the intermediate ones. But once you have the smaller beak size, you feed on smaller seeds. So these specialize on the smaller seeds, these specialize on the larger, harder seeds. This is character displacement. We've displaced these intermediate beak sizes to get to either a smaller or a larger size. And that is the result of evolution in response to competition. So competitions are selective force. All right. Now, niche space is under selection. And selection is gonna favor that resource usage where we don't have any overlap. And that overlap, we've depicted it as a complete shift. But we can also have a narrowing. We can become more specialized, or we can become a more generalist. We depicted beak sizes as being a shift. So you could say that, what kind of selection is that, by the way? Directional selection. So we depicted it as directional selection. But we could also have stabilizing selection at work, where we have a narrowing of our niche breadth, or perhaps a widening of our niche breadth. So selection's always at work. All right? And character displacement will become apparent. Now the question is, did the realized niche or the fundamental niche change? Well, I already told you that it was a fundamental niche. That's what selection's acting on. In order to demonstrate that we are getting this character displacement, we have to remove the competition to see what happens. If we remove the competitor and resource usage immediately expands, then what likely happened is that we saw a change in the realized niche space. Fundamental niche was already determined. You remove that competitor, they basically expanded. That was a barnacle example. You removed the one species, that second species immediately grew in and filled in that space. But if you remove that competitor and the species can't expand, then that was probably character displacement on the fundamental niche. Will it expand? Maybe, but we need evolutionary time to do so. That was also the barnacles, right? That was also the barnacles. The one was governed by the law of tolerance. Perhaps when we eliminate that competitor, our law of tolerance starts to expand so that barnacle species can expand into that niche space. So we have to demonstrate that, it was one versus the other. All right, I think what we're going to do is probably end here. I do have the quiz. We didn't quite finish this up, so I'm not going to release the quiz. We'll do, the life history, that deadline to complete it is still on Wednesday night, so that can get released. This quiz, we'll finish this up on Wednesday. There's only a couple slides left, and it's to go over this part. There's only a couple slides left, so that'll go live, and then you'll have until Thursday night, so that way you get it on Friday, and we can answer questions. All right, the quiz. Times. You can think of it as my preferred class times. 8 a.m., 9 a.m., and 10 a.m. Really don't care for the 11 and 12 times. So 8, 9, and 10, those are your answers. We're coming down to it. Only 2 more. All right. As you get the blood donor, I'll make a column in Blackboard gradebook, letting you know when I have it in my gradebook recorded. So if you told me or if you showed me your sheet already because you donated someplace else or at another time, another place, look for that column, and if I'm not updated, just send me an email. We'll look at it. All right. Those in Monday and Tuesday's lab, good luck on the diaspores. There is an element of chance at work, so good luck. See you on Wednesday.